we're going to be talking about the devils and the DevOps. I'm actually going to get out of the way. I'm going to hand it off to Warren, who's going to be moderating this panel. So Warren, have you?
Hello all. My name is Warren Clark. I'm currently a student, senior, and I'm a full stack engineer at Drift. We're going to introduce some of our panelists.
I'm Jessica Kalinowski. I am currently the Director of Infrastructure and DevOps for ConnectRN.
All right, Joe, you're up.
Hi, my name is Hoenzsch. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently a principal DevSecOps engineer and tech lead on the DevOps Center of Excellence at Ally Financial, though today is my last day with them, and I will be moving on to a company called Sentinel One in October.
Perfect. Well, how about we hop into things? So first and foremost, either of you can answer, what is DevOps for our newbies out there? I'm quite sure.
Do you want to go first,
Yeah.
Joe?
Sure, why not?
So
Yeah, so I think what's really cool about DevOps is the definition has definitely changed in some ways over time, because it was originally DevOps, which was the marriage of development and operations. So no longer thinking of your infrastructure as completely separate from your development processes, bringing those in as an integrated unit with a lot of automation. But I think we've even progressed beyond that now to DevSecOps, where security has become an integrated core part of it as well. And really you can think of it as having a marriage between the entire software development lifecycle, whether it is the actual development that you're doing, but also the testing, the scanning, the deploying, the monitoring, all as one sort of large automated fashion. I always say it's like, it's not just about the car that's driving on the highway, it's about the highway as well.
For sure.
that's a great analogy. We used to say it's the on-ramp. So I think DevOps has definitely transformed over the past few years. You've seen companies that have embraced site reliability engineering or cloud engineering. But at the end of the day, it's really a cultural shift, and you can make it what you need to be. As my CTO now says, it's just automate all the things. Whatever you can automate, whatever you can build into process to enable developer experience is really, the core of DevOps.
Perfect. Now that we kind of have this understanding as to the space that we're in this new topic, what's a good way to start a career in DevOps, and what are the steps?
I'll take where my journey came from. So I started in quality assurance back in the day when manual testing was the core. At the time, my company was transforming into more of a quality engineering organization. And so my journey to DevOps came from transformational leadership. So really at the crux of whatever an organization was trying to shift to. And that led me to site reliability and into more of the DevOps space, which really to embrace is a large cultural transformation. But maybe, Joe, you can share from the tech side how you got into DevOps.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I was an application developer at first. And basically what happened was at Ally Bank, we ended up having about, I believe, an 8-hour outage or something, some number of years back. And it was absolutely, everyone was running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And it was just absolutely wild. And believe it or not, the president of our bank, not a technical person, someone who's always been on the business side, came and said, we need to invest in really bringing DevOps because we need our, time to recovery. We need all of these different things we need to be more resilient. And so she basically started up a Tiger team with people from application developers all across different business units and whatnot. And I became a part of that team, and we sort of went on this huge revolutionary sort of journey. So for me, I had a sort of unique way of getting into it. But I would say in general, the way to get into DevOps is start thinking more. So if you're coming from a developer perspective, start doing some research into infrastructure. So maybe take a course on AWS if you're into public cloud, or start looking into various infrastructure as code tools like Terraform, Ansible, et cetera. But then at the same time, if you're coming from more of, let's say, a sysadmin experience, really start working on that development side, see what it's like to get an application all the way from your laptop to production. And once you sort of start building those skills, I always say DevOps is a really fortunate field to be in right now because there are many more positions than there are people to fill them. So if you show a passion for learning that, you're likely to find an organization that wants to have you.
Yeah, that's a great point. As someone who's hiring and building DevOps organizations, it's not so much about whether you've had the title, it's your drive for problem solving, for big problem solving, like I said, transformation, really empowering engineers to move faster and being that person in the org. So I look a lot at own and your drive to learn new tools and technologies.
And as we talk about new tools and technologies, do you have any best practices, maybe any tools that a startup should use?
Yeah, so I would say a big thing that you want to think about when you're newer is, first of all, what works for you? Because there are so many tools. Whether you use GitLab, GitHub Actions, you're on Jenkins, you're on any of these different sort of orchestration tools and whatnot. They all have benefits and disadvantages. But at the end of the day, if your developers aren't happy, you're not going to be able to have good code. And so you have to figure out what tools work best. So if you're a really heavy .NET shop, maybe Azure DevOps is just something that your team really understands more and works well with that. Go for that. At the end of the day, you can make arguments till the end of the earth about this tool is better than that tool, but you want your developers to be happy. And I would say a happy developer is worth 100 times more than, oh, this tool has slightly better, SAST scanning or something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Use native solutions. Use what AWS and Azure have out of the box to get you up and running. I think, as Joe said, you can argue for a tool all day long, and you can look at all the different tools. Those that work with me at my current company know I'm currently trying to detool the organization. We have everything under the sun. I think you just have to iterate. Me So if something's not working, pick yourself up and choose something else.
I think that's very good insight on that particular question. Another thing that I was kind of wondering is, what are the benefits of the infrastructure as code? Maybe solely in like the, I guess, startup aspect.
Well, I think something you run into with startups quite a bit is resiliency is not always there at the start. And a lot of times you are going to have outages, you're going to have problems. And what really matters more when you're at that sort of startup and smaller company is your time to recovery, because that's really what's going to happen. Because here's the thing, when you are newer as a company and still building up the technology, outages are going to happen. It's unfortunately, a fact of life. With infrastructure as code, even if your entire infrastructure gets blown away, you can re-provision all of that, with the click of a button, with the pipeline that you've created. Whereas if you set up, I don't know, an EC2 instance in AWS, you ran all these custom things, you installed packages manually, and that gets blown away for some reason, totally not recoverable for whatever reason, you're just stuck until you can absolutely build that infrastructure back up. So I find that's really helpful, as well as you want your development environment to match your production environment. So if you have infrastructure as code, the infrastructure should be provisioned in the same way, fingers crossed that it is, but it should be provisioned in the same way.
Is the weight and the importance of something like infrastructure as code, which is so foundational and so core to the business. And when it comes to recovery and automation, is often pushed to the side because we don't need that right now. But as Joe said, some of those foundational pieces can really help you along your journey in recovering and building that muscle memory at the gate.
Gotcha. And is deploying to production multiple times a day, is that realistic for a startup? Is that, I guess, moving in the right direction? Could you provide a little bit more context on that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So the ability to do it is important, and the more times you do something, the better you're going to get at it. So I would say for those reasons, yes, but I don't think the end goal is necessarily just because we deploy multiple times to production, that means we're more effective. I think it goes beyond that. I think what's really important is having a robust release orchestration method and a way to know that it's resilient, have done it enough times that you know that your release orchestration works well. But at the same time, I don't think the end goal in and of itself is deploying multiple times a day having inherent value. It's just the fact the more you do something, the better you are at it. And having the ability to do that when you do need to iterate really quickly is great. But I wouldn't say it's like we need to rush, and if we're not hitting that, then our metrics aren't great. It's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the goal of DevOps and automation around these practices is to deliver product value. So if you're clicking that button 6 times a day, but you're not actually delivering any value to your customer, do you need to hit that button? I think, again, you have to meet yourself where you are in the journey, and DevOps can be read in 20 different ways by 100 different people. So meet yourself where you are and stick to those core foundations of what you're trying to accomplish, and then measure your success.
And do any of you have an example of a CI/CD failure you've experienced?
Too many.
This might be traumatic, so take your time.
I'll take it first, although it was my team's failure. I tell this story often. I used to, when I ran site reliability for a different organization, a much larger organization, we did a little baptism by fire. And some of that was to teach that concept of being confident in failure. We wanted folks to be okay if they made a mistake and focus on how do we recover and what do we learn from that recovery? What could we do to prevent it in the future? And so I had a new employee. We were his first job out of an internship, and he did his first deployment and took our entire production environment down because of a misconfigured environment variable. He still talks about it to this day. I still mentor him, and the team came around him, and we recovered and we learned. And the big question we asked after that was, how do we stop this from happening the next time? So, though it was definitely a fail, as we say, fail forward. So we learned a lot. He learned a lot, and it actually built up his confidence to know that he could handle a failure that big, recover from it, and learn from it.
Absolutely. I think this is not necessarily the biggest failure we've had, but one that really made me think a lot is when you have developers that are, let's say, going exclusively to public cloud. They expect as long as their public cloud environment is up and running, they should be able to deploy, things should be fine. And we had an internal dependency as part of, within our data center, as part of our pipeline for our public cloud deployments. And so we had this thing in the background that most of the development teams deploying to public cloud did not even know this was a tool we had, but it was something our pipeline relied on. And so because of that, they're not able to deploy all of a sudden when that tool has an outage. And they're like, I don't get it. AWS is up, GitLab is up, everything is up that I touch and I use. Why can't I deploy? And we had this internal tool that was scanning dependencies and whatnot, but it was deployed in on-premise infrastructure. And because that was down, everyone's pipelines were failing. And so we started basically re-architecting our CI/CD pipelines, where if you're going to on-premise, you should mostly just have on-premise, dependencies for your deployments. If you are going to public cloud, you really should only have sort of public cloud dependencies for your pipeline. And by segregating those, it makes it so that you don't have these sort of cross-functional issues when something goes out.
And if you could possibly share maybe how you handle responsibilities within teams, and how is that kind of thing managed?
I'll start. So I think it depends. I've done a lot of different models, and I think depends on the size of the company, how long the company has been in practice. I've done models such as DevOps as a service, where you have that enables DevOps so that engineering teams can easily consume it. In that case, we actually ran 2 models at the same time. One was for legacy teams adopting cloud, where they had cloud operations as support. In the startup world, it's every man for himself, right? Everyone kind of wears multiple hats. So coming into a startup now that already is somewhat established, we have a really good shared responsibility model with our engineers. And our goal here is really model. So our engineers are in it with us. We're talking about our approach together, and we share the concept of what we're building with them.
I can speak to it more from a like a large organization perspective. When you have a smaller team, you're able to sort of have like an integrated DevSecOps team, and everyone really communally owns some level of that. When you get to larger companies and you're trying to make sort of more enterprise standards and whatnot, it becomes more difficult. So what we do is we sort of have like a global like center of excellence for the entire company as a whole, but then every business unit also has its own little center of excellence as well that knows the specific things that are sort of important to that business unit. And then the development teams themselves, we take them through dojos where they go from basically, it's okay if you're coming in with only development experience, but by the end, you're going to understand the full life cycle of your application, infrastructure as code, pipelines, et cetera. And so we try to really, democratize that knowledge. We want teams to really feel like they own their pipeline, but we also don't want them to have to think about little nitty gritty, interactions and whatnot that are happening behind the scenes. We want to give them tools that they can use, even if they don't fully 100%, understand exactly every little detail of how those tools are implemented.
We're going to get some more granular types of questions. So where do you fall between manual schedule releases and full CD automatically deployed to production? And where would you like to fall within those roles and experiences?
So where we are right now at Connect is, I would say we have semi-scheduled releases. So we're still going through more of a gated every 2-week deployment with the ability to deploy at will if we want to. What we're driving towards right now is full CI/CD, automated gates, DevSecOps, everything built in for early feedback for engineering. Being a smaller company, it's easier for us to make those.
Happen a little bit with that?
Sorry, my audio cut out there for a bit, so I missed that.
No worries.
But yes, I would say my company right now, it depends on the team. We have legacy teams that are still sort of doing more manual deployments, but then we have teams where, as a federally regulated institution being a bank, we have to have a lot of different change controls like in place. But we do have teams where they merge into their main branch and it kicks off a production pipeline, and they'll be doing blue-green deployments or canary deployments or whatever, and it'll go all the way out to production without any manual intervention, and open a change request, close it out. It can happen at all times of day. I would say there aren't many of those yet because we have a lot of prerequisites before we let people do that. So like you have to have really good control over your vulnerability population. You have to have really good test coverage. You have to be able to prove out a lot of things before we let you do that. But for the teams that are doing it, it's really cool, and it kind of gives a goal for people to strive towards. I don't know that it's realistic, at least in a larger organization, for every single application to be able to do that, whether it's because of staffing needs or it's a legacy application or things like that. But that should be the North Star at least.
And what metric do you look most at? So, in your day-to-day, what's that look like?
Yeah, that's going to be outages, time to recovery, time between getting an MR merged and like having a fully packaged ready piece of code and how long that takes to get to production. Those are a lot of the ones that we look at because those are really the things that have the most impact to our customers and our ability to have uptime as well as deliver value. So those are the main ones that we look at, but there's certainly a whole bunch of metrics that we track.
Joe.
Hey, sorry, did you lose
Sorry.
me there for a sec?
Is that just like as far as starting off, or is that something that's progressively throughout?
Yeah. So I think it is something when you start out, I think outages and time to recovery are definitely really key things to look at because those are the things that are really going to frustrate customers the most and be the most impactful. And how fast can you deliver value when your MR close to go out? I would say those are sort of the core ones that are good to start out with. And then as you become more mature, there's definitely a lot more metrics you can track.
I would agree. I think the standard DORA metrics are something that every company should look at earlier on in your journey. Observability is definitely a piece that can be left out. So also looking at how long it takes you to find an issue. So that's something we're working really hard at right now is increasing our mean time to identify or mean time to recover, as Joe said. So finding an issue before someone tells you you have one is a really good goal to have in this journey. And then, those standard mean time to deploy, mean time to recover. Some of the newer metrics in DevOps are things like defect density. So as you're measuring the health of your engineering teams, looking at how many defects per line of code versus, how many defects with specific features. Code coverage, all those things.
Joe, I'm gonna single you out on this one.
Sure.
So how can you mitigate the flasky tests in both the back end and front end? And are there any common causes that the engineer should look for?
So I think one of the issues with tests is a lot of times people don't start out doing that, especially at a startup. People do not really take a test first approach. It's let's get some value, let's show something out there. So, we have investors that want to see what we can do. We need to get this out immediately. And so trying to go back and write coverage can be really, really tough because what you could do is you say, well, I know how it works already because I already made it. So I can write a test that I know will pass. And that test might not really cover things as well as you want. So that's definitely a huge part of it. I think a lot of times also people focus so much on unit testing, but then when it comes to actual like integration tests, when you're integrating your API with another API, et cetera, and being able to mock those APIs to do that sort of more robust testing and whatnot, that people a lot of times struggle to actually get in there. I think what's really important is to try and do it as early as possible. And again, I know that's really tough when you have people banging down your door for like, new features and whatnot. But I think you'll end up separating yourself out in the market by being a much more resilient and reliable company than others if you really do get your testing all automated there with a high amount of coverage. And again, write your test cases before you write the code.
And is there any, how does the blue-green develop or deployment work? Deployment pattern?
Yeah, is that for me?
Jessica could, I picked on you enough.
You can answer. I think the idea around blue-green deployment is really a way to fast fail, right?
Okay.
You have two clusters live. You deploy the new code to one while the other retains the old code. Not everyone does it that way. I think in the startup world, a lot of folks will just kind of go for it and maintain one cluster. But long term, it is a safety net. It's an easy way to roll back or to target a certain percentage of traffic on your new code. So if you have a new feature, a new API, a new UI, you can have only a percentage that are actually seeing that while the rest remain on the old version.
Okay. That was a personal question. I wrote that down myself. I had to get that in there. All right. So what are the key differences between the containerization and virtualization? Joe, we're going to start with you again.
You said between containerization and virtualization?
I misspoke. Yeah, I meant to say that.
No, you're fine. Containers have completely changed the way that we develop code. I would say one of the #1 reasons a lot of times people would have issues with their production environments is they're manually maintaining all these different, virtual machines that, have different, maybe at different cycles and whatnot, and then having all these issues like, oh, the wrong version of Java's on this.
Internet speaking in.
That all in one thing. Thing that has, absolutely revolutionized the way that we're able to deliver code. And I think maybe one of the more interesting conversations as well is using more native tooling, like Amazon has ECS versus using something like EKS, which is a Kubernetes sort of deployment pattern. Because Kubernetes obviously is a standard that exists and can exist across many different, you could have an on-premise Kubernetes cluster, you could have one in AWS, you have one in GCS, but the way you deploy to it is much the same. Whereas the way you deploy to Google's container service versus Amazon's are going to be two very different ways. And so I think there's some interesting conversations to have around there about how, what are the benefits of being multi-cloud? What are the benefits of how portable your application is? I think there's a lot of really interesting things to say there. And I apologize if my audio was choppy at all there. My internet connection seems to not like me very much today.
No worries, no worries. Jessica, I actually have a question for you. So you have familiarity with more of a, I guess, larger company.
Mhm.
So what does the load balancing look like?
It depends. So I think I've worked in organizations that were much more like, I won't say their names, but e-commerce, as well as fintech companies. There, I think load balancing and your overall structure is really important. So strategies around being deployed multi-region, you can look at things like routing based on location and load balancing based on where your requests are coming from. Or if you're smaller scale, you may be a single region using something like Elastic Load Balancer if you're in an AWS native environment. I think it really depends on your use case. The one thing that I advise for smaller companies and startups is to start small. Um, Sometimes you'll hear people say, we're going to be active or active, basically deploying in regions across the country. And that's really good for resiliency. It's also super expensive. So as you're looking at your infrastructure builds and how you're architecting your resiliency, you also want to look at cost. Sometimes the value proposition just isn't there. If you have infrastructure as code and you can redeploy your infrastructure in another region within a few hours, is it really worth keeping several $1,000s of infrastructure running all the time? Probably not. Put that money towards some more engineers to buy a tool. But it just depends on where you are in your journey.
100%.
And is there any possible way that the DevOps troubleshooting can be optimized?
Yeah. So I think something that's interesting is we're seeing a lot of people move off of, so a lot of people used to use Jenkins for their whole CI/CD pipeline because it's an open source tool, there's a million plugins, and you can piecemeal all these things together and kind of get it to work as this Frankenstein pipeline. And what happens there is you lose a lot in observability because you have all these disparate tools that don't really talk to each other. And more we're seeing a lot of people move to like all-in-one platforms, whether it's GitLab or Azure DevOps or Harness or any of these other tools that give you a little bit more of, I can match up the code to the tests, to the scans, to the deployments. and you get a lot better error reporting. I think one other interesting thing is there's also like AI ops, which is coming in, where you basically can sort of see, hey, we see this error popping off in this application. We see it also popping off in this application. They're not applications that usually interact, but they have this common service. Hey, we think you should check this out. Like, there's these really interesting things that are coming out of that field. So I think AI ops is something to keep an eye out for as well.
AI is kind of the next phase running into the DevOps world. There's some really great also startups out there that are really doing a lot with the data. And so they're taking those errors and correlating that data for you. Or in some cases, you know, I think even GitHub released where they're autofilling code for engineers to reduce errors. So there's a lot of AI benefits, and some of the larger companies like the PagerDuties of the world are bringing AI ops into their platforms from an error reporting perspective. But there's also a lot of startups that are doing it as well in the observability space.
And so is AI more so?
On
Much experience with DevOps, but how would you implement a project that needs to have DevOps within it? Like, what's your go-to, Joe?
Yeah. So you're saying a team that doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience, but definitely wants to dip their toes. Use one of the all-in-one tools. Like I think so. GitLab is free for smaller, organizations. It has something called Auto DevOps, which basically implements a whole bunch of templates for you that will automatically scan your code, will build it, deploy it out. It can even do things like canary deployments and whatnot. If you're using like EKS, it'll build out your infrastructure for you. There's so many really cool things that like tools like GitLab have that allow you to do a bunch of stuff out of the box. So I would say look at one of those out of the box tools. Don't get too complicated with it when you're just starting out. Don't make customizations until you think you have a really good reason to make customizations. I think a lot of times people are like, oh, I want it to work slightly different. I want it to work slightly this way. But every single change you make out of defaults and standards is something you're going to have to manage as, potentially technical debt for who knows how long. So find one of those out of the box tools, like, like I said, GitLab, Azure DevOps, whatever works best for your organization, and try and stay as close to possible as their really recommended settings, and really only deviate away from that when you have a good reason to do it. And when you're younger as a company, there probably aren't as many reasons you need to deviate away. It's only once you start getting to be a much larger organization that you start to have to make those decisions.
Yeah, keep it simple is where I would go. I think there's kind of two variations that I've seen in my career. One is companies that aren't really thinking about it at all. And then they get, a year in, 2 years in, and they're like, ooh, we want to be DevOps. And that is a good time to invest and kind of come in and evaluate your process and your culture, your tool set, et cetera. And then I see large companies that don't really invest in any of those standards, kind of staying with that base tool set or keeping it simple from the get-go, and they're looking at a much larger transformation. So one of the things that I would encourage companies from the get-go is deciding if DevOps is important to you, deciding if that automation is important to you, because it is much easier to build that culture from the start and innovate and learn as you go than making it a year down the line. And I think you brought this up earlier, Joe, saying like, we have no test coverage. We don't even know what this does, right? You have scrappy engineers moving fast. There's a lot of really foundational steps that help you if you just do them right from the beginning.
I think that's a great point. And I would say one of the biggest ones I think people miss out on is dependency scanning. I forget the exact statistic, but it's something like 92% of code that's in most applications is not code that you wrote. It's open source libraries that you pulled in. Those open source libraries can very often be vulnerable. I don't know if any of you remember when, oh gosh, the Equifax had their huge breach and everyone's social security numbers were leaked. That was because of an open source package with a Sev10 critical vulnerability that had been identified over a year before that was never patched out of their application. And I think a big thing that people overlook is like, your code nowadays is only a small percentage of your actual application. These open source libraries are a huge part of it. So if you say there's only one thing you want to bring in early on, I would say dependency scanning, make sure your dependencies are up to date and make sure they're vulnerability free. And you've already brought down like 90% of your vulnerability population.
Either you or Jessica.
Sorry, I missed that question. My audio cut out again. My internet is.
Sorry. So I asked, is there any benefit of using VCS? If you could provide what VCS is.
So I'm going to guess Joe's doing the same thing I am. So terminology is different in every company. Yeah.
The version control system.
Okay.
Sorry.
So that could have been like code scanning, version control.
Whatever
like,
you did, I would have went with it. I would have been for it.
Version control is key, 100%. You should be there from absolutely day one. You're not using Git, it's probably not right. And I'm sorry to anyone who still loves Subversion out there, but you absolutely need version control, and you need a good branching structure. You may not need the full thing of like Git flow, for example. You maybe just need a main branch with like a trunk style system that you branch off of, but oh my gosh, version control is the number one most 100% important thing that you can possibly have. And if you don't have that now, that would be the number one first thing I'd recommend doing.
Yeah. Again, keep it simple. Like Joe said, Git flow. Like these tools have things like version control flows built in. A simple Google search will give you 5 different ways you can start out. All of them are okay. There really isn't a need to reinvent the wheel in this space. Just stick with something foundational.
Perfect. And how are we doing for? Are there 20 minutes? Perfect.
I was going to say, it's funny you say about keep it simple for that. I remember one of the teams we were onboarding to the CI/CD pipeline. I went to their repo and their default branch was develop, and I was like, okay, that's interesting, but okay. And then I start looking in, and they have master A, master B, and master C, and I was like, oh gosh, what's going on here? And they had this whole convoluted way that they were doing deployments with different branching structures, and we basically met with the team. Was like, all right, we're gonna pare this down, find out what you actually need, and find like a pre-existing structure to bring you into, because managing those things can easily just become a huge burdensome task.
Do either of you have any personal stories or personal stories about your experience?
I can share, my journey has been, as I said, more on the leadership side. So it's a lot of strategy and a lot of coming in and looking at companies, and 9 times out of 10, they're looking for someone to help them find their way. They want to move faster. For me, finding the why is how I spell out their strategy. And DevOps is a space where you can go with the SRE approach that partners with DevOps. You can go with the platform as a service approach that partners with DevOps. DevOps as a whole is really a cultural change, and it very much requires leadership from the top down to be embracing that as an important piece of their company and their culture. The tech part is easy. We can do it 2,500 different ways. We can choose, a left or a right path, but I would really encourage those that are looking at the importance of DevOps, and especially, as Joe said, DevSecOps. There's a lot of open source tools out there and they're awesome. But you do put yourself at risk if you're not building that culture in the beginning of looking at those things. I think product value becomes something that's super important to startups, and it should be. But when you go too long without implementing testing, or you go too long without looking at security, you're building up a backlog of items that do put you in a risky position. And one big incident where someone's information gets out and it can be detrimental to an organization.
And Joe, do you have any wise words for us?
Yeah, I would say show the value. If you are looking to implement DevOps at your company, show the value. And one of the things we did is we found a team that we knew was already very advanced, had good test coverage, had really done a lot of great things. And we took them and we brought them through as a package where they were able to say, yeah, let's say I really want to commit this, line of code or whatever. Here, I just merged it into main. And they asked another team, how would you get this deployed to production? They said, well, we'd open up a change request. We have to do that at least 10 days prior. And then we would pick a window for it to go. We would have this outage window where it's going to be down. We'd take it off. We'd email out after the update was done. We'd go out, and then it would be in production. And it's like, great. How long do you think it takes this team? And so I was like, they already merged, and I click into the production, deployment. I'm like, and would you look there? It's about 6 minutes later, and it's now live in their B cluster. Oh, do we want to make that over to live? Great. Let's flip the, the route in the F5, and it's now pointing to the bit for the B cluster. Great, there you are. We are now live in production, and it took 6 minutes after merging into our main branch. And people see that, and they're like, wow, if we could deliver that to the value, that'd be amazing. And once you get people to sort of buy in that way, you get people being like, okay, maybe I should really work on my code coverage. Maybe I should really work on these things. Because if you're telling me I can get all that, if I do these things, I'm in. I want to do that. I want to get rid of all this red tape, between me and production.
Perfect. And before we jump into the questions in the comments, I do have one more. So how can DevOps be implemented securely, and what are the security practices that are being tacked on in nowadays workspace?
I think, again, going to the tools, it's early feedback for engineers. So DevSecOps is really just implementing that early scanning and that early feedback. What I've found that helps to ensure those vulnerabilities are building automated gates, giving developers exactly what it is early on, because when they're in that code and they see that they can't get past that critical, result, you tell them exactly what they need to fix. They fix it there, off they go. If you come back later, 6 months later, a year later, and say, hey, we finally scanned our code, can you go look at this thing? They're going to have no idea what you're talking about. And so it's much easier to have that built-in early feedback and eventually create a really good process of, whether you use it as an actual gate where developers can't check in when they have a critical vulnerability. You can choose your path there, but I find the earlier you're giving that feedback and the more you're helping engineers understand what it means to code with reliability or security in mind, the better practice and the more, the faster you'll be able to get your code going without those bumps in the road.
Yeah, I would say that's perfectly on point. And I would say one thing I want to say for people who are maybe intimidated, if let's say you haven't been scanning your code and you scan it for the first time, you find out there's a million vulnerabilities and whatnot, do what's going to give you the most bang for your buck. So the very first thing to do, implement a check that says no net new vulnerabilities. Don't say you can have no vulnerabilities in your application at first. Put in a gate that just says no net new. So you can't be introducing new ones. From there, start saying, hey, let's just knock out all the sev10s. Let's find out what those are. Let's create stories in our backlog. Let's knock those out. That's going to give us the most bang for our buck. You don't have to go instantly, from one day, tons of vulnerabilities to the next day, oh, we're vulnerability free, because you'll be chasing that goal for the rest of your life. go where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Don't overwhelm yourself. Figure out what you can do, because anything's better than just ignoring them and thinking it's an overwhelming task and not approaching it at all.
So we have just about 15 minutes left. So we might just kick it into the comments and see what our audience thinks.
Yeah, the first one's really how, based on your experience in the DevOps space, how does someone speak towards the networking within DevOps in the Boston area, or now that we're in kind of a remote work situation, are there remote national groups that they can be a part of or connect with? Jessica, do you want to start?
On LinkedIn, there's also DevOps Days, which is similar to Startup. Really embracing DevOps and the DevOps space from a leadership perspective. So hit the interwebs, look at the conferences, and then there's a lot of talks and groups where people just get together to freely exchange ideas on what we are doing, what's working, what's not working.
Yeah, I would say another thing you could do is if you're trying to figure it out within your company, figure out who your partners are for software and things like that. Like, do you work with Red Hat? Do you work with groups like that? A lot of times they'll have DevOps specialists in it that are really, really interested in things. So like we ended up having, you know, John Willis, one of the authors of the DevOps handbook, come in and speak to all of us and do an analysis of our DevOps maturity and stuff like that, just because we were talking with him based on just reaching out to Red Hat saying we're doing this DevOps journey. And they're like, and he was like, hey, like, I'd love to do an assessment on you. And we got to talk to, you know, one of the actual fathers of, you know, DevOps, which was really, really cool. So try and leverage any connections your company might have with different, you know, vendors that you use and stuff. Sometimes you might be surprised on who they have connections to. And, you know, because a lot of the people in the DevOps field do it because they're really passionate about it, which is why it's huge, not just among companies, it's huge in the open source community. I mean, I would say a solid 90% of the tools, other than security tooling, that people use in DevOps is open source.
Yeah, that's great feedback. I think this is one of the communities where folks in leadership and beyond actually do communicate. I talk to leaders at other companies. We're exchanging ideas. We're talking strategy. So, you know, connect with folks on LinkedIn. Look at your partners, your tooling partners, and really just start the conversation, because 9 times out of 10 or even more in this space, people are going to want to talk and understand where they can learn from others that are struggling with similar challenges.
There's another question here, so it's a little bit over my personal head, so I'm going to learn a lot here. But there, a gentleman by the name of Dejan, I want to make sure I pronounce that correctly, but he's just asking, what's wrong with a branch name develop? You know, Git branching strategies to find ways of working. It's not something that must be strictly followed. So
I apologize. My internet cut out there again.
That's okay. So we're referring to the question, if you see in the chat, Dejan's question, where he's asking about more of the terminology of why the branch is named development rather than main. And I'm not quite sure. Yes.
So yeah, Git flow is a process where you basically have 2 long-lived branches. One's called develop and one's called main. Your default branch is usually the one that goes out to production. So when I mentioned develop earlier, I was talking about a team who had their default branch as develop, which is a branch that will never touch production. And then they had 3 production branches, main A, main B, and main C. And so that was kind of one of the things I jumped into. At the end of the day, do what works well for you. But one of the things I really like using now is something called GitLab Flow, which is really simple. It gets rid of release branches. It gets rid of develop branches. It only really works if you are doing infrastructure as code and your infrastructure is getting built out alongside your deployments. But it's really useful because you just branch off of your trunk and you're able to merge that in when you know, things are ready. And basically the idea is everything that's in main is always ready to go out to production. But you can also follow Git flow, where you have long live main and develop goes out, to your model environment, whereas main goes out to your production environment, and you can sort of have two longer lived branches. Again, it's whatever works best for you. What I just find is a lot of tools like GitLab, GitHub, etc., expect you to use like trunk-based development or Git flow or something like that. And so because of that, they develop their tooling around the expectation that you're doing that. And the second you start really diverging from that, all of a sudden you can run into issues like, this doesn't do what I need it to. And unless you're a huge organization with lots of money to swing around, it's unlikely that GitHub, the company, is going to completely change how their product works just to suit your niche need.
So as an extension, actually, of the previous session right before you guys took the stage, where they were talking about Web3, is there, are you seeing any trends, whether in the new talent pool coming up in the DevOps space that's more focused on that area? They were speaking how it's very hard to find talent in that space to work in this direction. Again, a little out of my league, so I'm just trying to figure out if this, are you seeing a change in the way people are developing, both as in their careers, and if this is becoming a major piece of what a startup needs to become later on?
That's a fantastic question. And I would say if you can find a single university that is teaching DevOps to their undergrad computer science program, please tell me, because they need to be doing it. It's the first thing anyone runs into now when they join a company after graduating. But unfortunately, it's something that no one is teaching at the university level. However, coding boot camps are. And a lot of times you end up having developers come in. They're like, I already know pipelines. I already know these things. I know these things. And I think it's something universities sort of need to catch up on. So a lot of times when you're recruiting new talent, it's really tough because you do have to take them from ground zero and work them their way up into building out their DevOps tooling. And I would love to see more opportunities for people that are new in the career to have some of that background going in. And I think it's a shame that we don't see more of it until really you get to like the graduate level of, software engineering.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think over the past few years, as DevOps and SRE really became more of an industry standard where companies were embracing, I will say that the talent comes from all different areas. So I've hired from like AWS Restart, which is a great program for the community. They're going into, under to keep your mind open as a hiring manager in this space to look less at the resume and more in conversation on what the person's interested in, what their drive is, the tools. As it always goes with engineering and technology, it's coming out much faster than we're updating our college programs. So, open your mind to the kind of talent that you're looking for and what you're hiring. Because there are a lot of great folks out there that maybe come from less than traditional backgrounds.
So do you know of any programs right now for those that are already in their career post-college that can dive deeper into this area to, upscale the resume a bit?
Absolutely. GitLab offers training, and you can get certified from GitLab, for example. Azure DevOps does certifications. AWS, Code Pipeline does certifications. So definitely, if you look to like any of those big ones and you want to get certified, it's a great way to do it. But I will also say some of those certifications cost money. And if you don't want to spend any money doing it, the internet is a beautiful resource. And honestly, there are so many amazing tutorials that are out there, even just on YouTube and whatnot, that can help you, get involved with that. And I would say the biggest thing is just do a pet project at home. Take a Hello World application that doesn't need to do anything, but then see if you can take it through all the stages of testing it, scanning it, deploying it, monitoring it. Like Google, how do I do blue-green in AWS ECS? Or, something like that. Just Google, how do I do that? And follow along with some of those tutorials. And I think you'll learn a lot by being hands-on.
One in the crowd here? Yeah.
So I guess I have a few questions, if I may. So the first one is, are you considering or have you considered low code in the DevOps practice, especially for infrastructure automation? So still honoring as code and automation and version control and so on, but have you considered low code technologies?
I think I consider every technology in this space. It just depends on where your organization is, but yeah, I think it's definitely something that folks are paying more attention to.
Yeah, I think the low code, no code industry is still so new that there aren't many tools that leverage them that I would consider like enterprise ready. But it's getting there, and I think it certainly is somewhere we're going to get. I just have not found any of those sort of low code, no code tools that I've found to be mature enough, at least for like a large enterprise. But I'm happy to be proven wrong on that, and I do think it is more and more going to be the future.
Okay, thank you. I guess a shameless plug that we are a small startup company which have a low code platform for, but as you mentioned, it's not for enterprise. It's not enterprise ready. It's a small and medium and startup sized companies. The second question was around the new thing. I guess everybody's talking about platform engineering. So I guess in your experience, are they part of DevOps? Are they outside of DevOps? Are they engineering?
I've seen it all ways. So the original model I was a part of, we built platform engineering that was partnered with SRE. The concept there was really DevOps as a service. So building a platform that we could then hand off to engineers, make it easier for them to manage, like really self-service their infrastructure, security, all those things. It worked. It was okay. I think it was tougher for organization, like the half of our organization that was really legacy to adopt that. They needed a lot more lift, which is why we kept CloudOps as part of the picture. In newer organizations, like what we're building right now is somewhere hybrid of that. So Connect, we have cloud engineering, which you could consider a platform. So we're doing standards, the infra is code templates, DevSecOps. So building in the capabilities into the pipeline. And you are going to build something out like platform engineering, my very strong recommendation is keep it lean. Don't overpopulate the platform team with a ton of engineers. Focus on automation, focus on good practice and good standards without filling the gaps that you have with more bodies, because that will continue to scale and you're kind of setting the tone away from DevOps when you do that.
Sorry, just one last question. Especially for small and medium-sized companies, so I guess who in DevOps is in charge of cost controls? I guess who should look after cost? Because coming from an enterprise background, because especially the companies that I worked with, they used to say, hey, this was supposed to do X, Y, Z, but now this is doing A, B, C, and this is 10 times more expensive than what it was. So in your experience, who handles cost?
That is me. So cost in a lot of different avenues. So I've seen models where I think in the small or medium space, you're really looking at smart projections when it comes to infrastructure, but they're pretty light. So as far as monitoring both our tooling infrastructure, people looking at that at the same time because they might not understand what's impacted it.
So we are just about at time, so I want to make sure you have one last chance to say, if there's one thing that a founder or a DevOps manager, whoever might be listening to this, that this is most important for, what's the one thing you want them to take away from everything that was covered in the past 60 minutes?
I would say it's a lot easier than you think. Get started with one of those out-of-the-box tools. Try it out. You'll see the value a lot faster than you think you will.
I am not going to disagree from that. Keep it simple. Don't think you need to build an entire strategy for 3 years. The whole idea is to iterate. So jump in and then learn, and then continue to learn and continue to grow and change. But don't overthink it. Just invest in that as a practice.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate, again, all your time, and I know everyone virtually and those in the crowd do as well. So thank you so much. Excellent. So we are moving on to our about 15